May I speak in the name of God, who creates, redeems, and sanctifies us.
Amen.
Amen. It's very good to be back with you after so long. I discovered when I got into the vestry that there was a bag with my purple stole in it, which means that the last time I was preaching was in Lent 2020, which is just before we went into lockdown, of course. And it's been an extraordinary time and remains an extraordinary time. And today's readings from Isaiah and from Hebrews seem to be grappling with this kind of experience of extraordinary times, of testing times, placed in the language or couched in the language of suffering. In Christian interpretations, Isaiah's suffering servant is generally understood as a precursor of Christ. He was wounded for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises are we healed. The suffering servant songs in Isaiah are a reminder to us that already in the Old Testament there is a strand of teaching that says that suffering may be redemptive. And reflecting on today's readings, John Foley, a Jesuit, writes, "Suffering may well stretch and widen the human soul, making it large enough to know God." And indeed, it may. And I want to emphasize the word may because I don't think it's something that we should take for granted. And as I'm going to argue in this sermon, I don't think it's something we should ever impose on other people. There are many accounts, though, of the ways that suffering or hardship can be stretching or even essential to development. Preparing this sermon, I came across a story of a visitor to an orange grove, presumably somewhere in California or in the American South, I think. They go to one farm where the immigration pump has broken down in the middle of an unusually dry season, and some of the trees are beginning to die for lack of water. But then they go to another farm where the trees, despite the dry summer, seem to be much more bearing fruit and flourishing. And the owner of that farm says, yes, the trees here could go without rain for another 2 weeks, because when they were young, I frequently kept water from them. And that hardship caused them to send their roots deeper into the soil in search of moisture. So these trees are the deepest rooted trees in the area. While others are being scorched by the sun, these trees are finding moisture at a deeper depth, at greater depth. The lack of water early gave the trees the ability to draw water when there was from a deeper soil. There are similar stories about people finding a butterfly or a moth emerging from its cocoon and deciding to help it emerge by cutting the cocoon open. But the problem is that the butterfly or the moth develops its wings by struggling to free itself from the cocoon, so that merciful snip, writes one author, was in reality cruel. Sometimes the struggle is exactly what we need. We may not always recognize what we've learnt from painful experiences. It may take talking to someone else to help us to realize how we may have been deepened or changed by what we've been through. Bob Benson tells a story about his friend who had had a heart attack. It didn't seem like the man would live, but eventually he did recover. Months later, Bob asked him, "So how did you like your heart attack?" It almost scared me to death, says the friend. Would you go through that again? No. Would you recommend it? Definitely not. Does your life mean more to you now than it did before? Well, yes, I suppose it does. You and your wife have always had a beautiful marriage, but are you now closer than ever? Yes, actually, we are. Do you perhaps have a new compassion for people, a deeper understanding and sympathy? Yes, I think I probably do. So, how did you like your heart attack? I think the point of this story is that suffering can reveal to us our true priorities, offer us new ways of thinking about things, lead us to a deeper understanding of God. Malcolm Muggeridge reflected towards the end of his life, I look back on experiences that at the time seemed especially desolating and painful. But I look back on them with particular satisfaction. Indeed, he says, I can say with complete truthfulness that everything I've learned in my 75 years in this world, everything that has truly enhanced and enlightened my existence, has been through affliction and not through happiness, whether pursued or attained. Now, I would want to be very cautious about being that categorical. My own experience is that I do gain important insights from being happy and from being joyful and from the good things of life, as well as from suffering and from pain. But I think Muggeridge's point here is important. And all of these 4 vignettes really offer us ways of thinking about how suffering, how struggle, how pain can help us to grow and to develop, and how meaning can emerge from suffering. But at the same time, I think we need to be very cautious indeed about offering interpretations to people who are in the midst of suffering. Because there's no question at all that suffering, that grief, that pain can also be completely debilitating. That it doesn't always seem to result in redemption. That people do find their faith shaken by the experience of deep suffering or of sudden loss. If that experience is to have meaning, it needs to come from or be discovered by those who are experiencing the suffering, maybe in conversation, as with Bill Benson, but it needs to come from their experience. It needs to be their understanding and true experience of redemption. That meaning cannot be imposed from outside. And in fact, trying to impose meaning can come across as a lack of care or as a trite platitude. Alia Joy writes of a time when her child was very ill. The doctors had no idea what was wrong. They had no answers. But she writes, though the medical community struggled to sort it out, my faith community seemed to have every answer. God would provide, one said, because God would respond to my great faith. God was setting up a miracle, another said. God works all things together for good, I was reminded. Platitude, platitude, platitude. I smiled, she writes, through all of them, even nodded, but silently I wondered whether these words amounted to anything, even though they were well-meaning. Hunched over my son, these platitudes haunting me, my phone rang. I looked at the screen and read the name. It was a pastor from a church in my hometown. And as I answered the phone, I wondered what platitude I might hear this time. Would he tell me there was a purpose in my son's suffering, that everything has a kingdom purpose? We exchanged greetings and I clenched my jaw, stiffened and braced myself. Through the phone, I heard only 3 words. I'm so sorry. There was a pause, and he told me to shout if I needed anything. He said he'd be praying. And that was it. It was, she writes, a moment of selfless solidarity, a moment in which this man of the cloth didn't force-feed me an anemic answer or sell me some fix-it-all version of a bright and shiny gospel. Rather, he did the work of Christ himself. He entered into my suffering. And years later, after a long season of healing my sons and my own, this pastor's words served as a reminder of the Christian response to suffering. We enter into it together. We share in it together. We lament together. I'm so sorry. I hear your pain. Sometimes that is all we can say and all we need to say. Max Lucado tells a story which reminds us that we should not be too quick to seek meanings in what happens to us. We may need to wait in order to understand what we are experiencing and what we have experienced. We should not be too quick to judge. I'm going to give you the beginning of the story because it does go on a bit, but I will post the rest of it on my sermon blog. There was an old man who lived in a village who was poor, but he was envied by all because he owned a beautiful white horse. One morning he found that the horse was not in the stable. The other people in the village came to visit him and said, "You old fool, we told you that someone would steal your horse. You're so poor. It would have been better to have sold him. Now the horse is gone and you've been cursed with misfortune." The old man responded, "Don't speak too quickly. Say only that the horse is not in the stable. That's all we know. The rest is judgment. How can you know if I've been cursed or not? How can you judge?" The people of the village laughed. They just thought the man was crazy. But after a while, the horse returned. It hadn't been stolen. It had run away into the forest. And not only did it return, it brought a dozen wild horses back with it. Once again, the village people gathered behind the woodcutter. "Old man," they said, "you were right and we were wrong. What we thought was a curse was a blessing. Please forgive us." The man responded, "Once again, you go too far. Say only that the horse is back. Say that a dozen horses returned with him, but don't judge. How do you know if this is a blessing or not? You only see a fragment. Unless you know the whole story, how can you judge?" "Maybe the old man's right," they said, but they didn't say anything more to him, but deep down they knew it was a blessing, because with a little work, the 12 horses could be trained and sold for a lot of money. And it goes on, the man's got a son, and then he's breaking the horses and he breaks his legs, so that's a curse. And then they come and there's a war breaks out and the son is not conscripted into the army because he's got broken legs, so is that a blessing? But the point is, it's a fragment. We don't always know. We only know when we can see the whole, and we may not see the whole for a long time. No one is wise enough to know, the story finishes, because only God knows. This past week, I've been speaking at a clergy study day in the Diocese of Leeds, which was my first in-person event since the winter of 2019-20, apart from preaching, so that was quite exciting. I was asked by Bishop Nick there to reflect on historical understandings of pandemic and how the church has responded to it. And in the questions afterwards, someone asked me what all that has happened to us over the past 18 months and how, looking back at what has happened in history and reflections on pandemics and times of crisis in history, what that tells me about God. What is my image of God? We've been talking a lot in that meeting about Job. Job, who lost all his family and all his property, but somehow held on to his trust in God, and in the end was granted a new beginning. In the end, Job experienced God as redemptive, the redemptive God to whom Isaiah's suffering servant also witnesses, the redemptive God whom Christ incarnates in the New Testament, the God who offers us new beginnings even when we find ourselves at our most bleak, the God who gives us Easter Sunday after our Good Friday and our Holy Saturday, the God who leads us into resurrected life. That is the promise of our faith. But we may need to be patient to see those times of resurrection. And we may need to be really cautious about telling other people that what they're experiencing is resurrection life. Let's just finish with a prayer. Loving God, in times of trial, I offer up to you my confusion. Give me clarity. I offer up to you my despair. Give me hope. I offer up to you my weakness. Give me strength. I offer up to you my pettiness. Give me generosity of spirit. I offer up to you all my negative thoughts, so that when I am asked, where is your God now, I may respond, right here with me, giving me grace as a heavenly beam of light penetrating the darkness. Amen.